We're going to look at text of the Old Testament, and then do some exercises to do with translations. And if we have time, we might just start looking at the Pentateuch, the issues there. But we'll start with the texts of the Old Testament. And this website that I've discovered, which I've rated, and you're going to see in the slides that follow, this website, I'll put the link to this in the chat a bit later. But this talks about the 3 oldest examples of the Hebrew scriptures that we have. So that's not the books that were written at the oldest time, but this is the actual physical artifacts that we have that are dated to the oldest period. The oldest one for a while was the Nash Papyrus, which was bought in 1902 from an antiquities dealer by a guy called Nash. That's why it's called the Nash Papyrus. There are scholars that devote themselves to dating things like this. They can tell that by carbon dating of the material and also by the handwriting style, like English handwriting style, Hebrew handwriting style evolved over the centuries. And so this is believed to have dated to the 2nd century before the Common Era. It was the oldest known biblical text in the modern world prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the content, in case you can't read that Hebrew that's there, the content, the 10 commandments found in the Exodus version, the 10 commandments appear both in Exodus and in Deuteronomy. This is the Exodus text. And then the text from Deuteronomy, the Shema Yisrael, Hear, O Israel, the Lord God, the Lord is one. The daily prayer of Jews, and also we know it from the New Testament because Jesus directly refers to it. So that was the oldest. And then from 1947 onwards, a series of scrolls rolled up and hidden in caves, in pottery in caves, what we know as the Dead Sea Scrolls, began to be discovered. And between 1947 and 1956, in 11 of the caves around Qumran, near the Dead Sea, a series of manuscripts, over 900 manuscripts in total, were discovered. Qumran was the place that the Essenes built. It was a kind of a commune, a community out in the desert that existed for some centuries. And these books are believed to be the library of that community. All books of the Old Testament, except for Nehemiah and Esther, are included. And then as well as that, there's their own scroll, the scrolls for their own rules, the rules of the community, the scroll that tells the story of the war of the sons of light and the sons of darkness, a fierce apocalyptic text, and a whole lot of other prayers and so on. Now, dating these manuscripts, scholars believe that they actually come from the whole period that the Qumran community was in residence there. So that's from the 3rd century before the time of Jesus right through to the middle of the 1st century. The buildings there were actually destroyed and the community was dispersed as part of the conflict during the Roman-Jewish War of 66 to 74. So that's why they stop in the 1st century. Now, these were earlier than the Nash Papyrus that we saw. Before their discovery, the earliest complete collection of Old Testament books in Hebrew that we had was the Leningrad Codex, so named because that's where it lives. It's in a library in Leningrad. And that was dated quite precisely to the year 1008 of the Common Era. So one of the reasons why the Dead Sea Scrolls are so hugely significant is that it gives us insight into what gives scholars insight into what the text of the Old Testament was like 1,000 years before the then earliest version that we have. This is an example of one of the very oldest fragments from the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's a portion of the text from Exodus and Leviticus. It's a good example to show you the difficulties that are faced in reconstructing the text of these kind of documents. It's known as 4Q17. Now, 4 is the cave that was found in, Q is a Qumran document, and 17 probably means it was the 17th document found and deciphered in cave 4. So that's how all of the Dead Sea Scrolls are identified, as the number of the cave, Q for Qumran, and then another number. So these papyri had been rolled up and stored in pottery jars in the caves, and that's why they managed to survive for a millennia until we discovered in the modern era. Now, more recently than that, in the excavation season of 1979 to 1980, in a series of burial caves at Ketef Hinnom in Israel, 2 silver amulets were found. They are believed to contain the oldest biblical text that we now have, the oldest example physical artifact. And they are dated to the 7th century before the Common Era. And the text is actually the priestly benediction that we should be familiar with. May Yahweh bless you and keep you. May Yahweh cause his face to shine upon you and grant you peace. That's in chapter 6 of Numbers. This is what it looks like. Left column is a photograph. The right column, the middle column is a transcription of the Hebrew, and you can see it's almost like cuneiform, the Hebrew style from the 7th century. That's one of the reasons they can date it to that. And then a right-hand column of the transcription of the Hebrew letters. And 2 things to note about the transcription. One is that there are dashes, and the dashes correspond to where the actual amulet is either damaged or there is a part missing. So we don't know what they are, but from the letters that are surviving, they've been able to reconstruct that it's number 6, the priestly blessing. The other thing to note is that you only have their consonants. Hebrew has a system of writing the consonants, and then at a later stage, the priests started to add the vowels, and they are done in a series of dots and dashes, pretty much like the Morse code system that we know. So dots and dashes either above or in the middle or below the consonants. So that's one thing that's very significant in terms of text criticism, that the early texts of the Hebrew Bible just have the consonants, and you have to work out what the word is from the consonants, assuming that you have a good knowledge of Hebrew and you can supply appropriate vowels. It also means that there's possibility of different readings at various points. Has anyone got any questions about that thus far?
What about the manuscripts that were found in Egypt?
The Nag Hammadi texts.
Yeah, and I think there was some at a place called Onyx.
Oxyrhynchus.
Yeah.
Yeah, Nag Hammadi and Oxyrhynchus are both significant for the New Testament, and Nag Hammadi in particular is significant for Gnostic developments subsequent to the New Testament. So there are a whole lot of documents in that are Christian documents, but not orthodox in our understanding. They're far more Gnostic. Oxyrhynchus, the papyri that were found in Oxyrhynchus, actually they're in Greek or Coptic, and they include not just New Testament texts, but letters, a whole lot of secular ordinary stuff. I'm not sure that there's Hebrew text in either of those, actually. Okay, so they are fragmentary examples of the oldest, but we do have complete versions of the text of the Old Testament, and I want to say a little bit about that. The Hebrew text is known as the Masoretic text, and the Masoretes were a priestly group, and what they did was they collected all of the texts together, and then they actually started to provide the pointing, the dots and the dashes for the vowels. So that's old, not quite as old as the Dead Sea Scrolls, though. The Samaritan Pentateuch, the Samaritans evolved as followers of the law of Moses, but they split from the Jews. They kept that, for them, Scripture just comprised 5 books, and that's the Pentateuch. But they had it in a distinctive version. They had their own version of it, their own translation, written in Samaritan script, which is like Hebrew but slightly variant. So one of the world-leading scholars in the Samaritan texts is Alan Crown, who lectured in Jewish studies at Sydney University for many, many decades. Now, of course, in the ancient world, Greek became the dominant language with the rise of the Greek Empire under Alexander the Great. And so a document known as the Septuagint was created, and the story is that 70 learned scholars were drawn together with the task of translating the Hebrew text into Greek. And so we have the Septuagint as an example of what the Hebrew text was understood to be from 100 and something or other years before the time of Jesus. But it's in Greek, not in Hebrew. When the Jews went into exile in Babylon and stayed there for quite a while, the Babylonian influence included influencing their language. By the time they returned to the Holy Land, to Jerusalem, the language that they were using, the Hebrew that they were using, had been influenced by Babylonian and comes to be known as Aramaic. So Aramaic was the ordinary language at the time of Jesus. The text was still in Hebrew, but the people spoke in Aramaic. Now, Targums were made in Aramaic. Targum simply means a paraphrase. So this is like a Bible, not like the NRSV or the NIV, but a paraphrase more like the Living Bible or the Message or something like that. And the Aramaic Targums give you the text and then give some explanation, expansion, interpretation. So that's another viewpoint into the text of the Old Testament. And then, of course, Jews were living in the dispersion in all sorts of places, and they did what everyone does. We see this in contemporary life, that sacred texts get translated into your own language. So the Syriac Peshitta comprises the text in Syriac, Coptic in Egypt, Ethiopic in Ethiopia, Armenian, Arabic. And then we come also, so these are all translations of the text of the Old Testament. And then we come to Jerome in the early 400s, and Jerome, a Christian scholar, made a translation from the Hebrew into Latin, because by that stage, the Holy Roman Empire was the dominant empire of that part of the world, and Latin was the preferred language. So the name Vulgate simply comes from, Vulgate means the common language. So he was translating the Hebrew text into the common language. And that's another version. So the arcane world of text critics of the Old Testament is that such scholars have to be able to have facility in a number of these different languages to compare the different versions that they find and to make assessments of what they believe might have been the original text. And the translations that we have benefited from the work of such scholars.
Noting they need to glue it back together.
The Septuagint. What's the date of the Septuagint?
I should have looked this up. It's so is it, I think it's 100 and something or other BCE, John.
Yeah.
I'll look it up while you're in a chat room and I should know it. I should know it because I taught that, but it's just fallen out of my head.
Well, it's pretty old relative to everything else.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah.
So that's the key, that if you back translate from the Greek back into the Hebrew, you then have a version of the Hebrew that was current in sort of 120 or whenever it was BCE.
John, in the examples that you gave previously, it seemed that on the scrolls there were just bits and pieces of some text. When did the Genesis and Exodus, the Torah, when did it take shape as as a document as opposed to just bits and pieces?
Yeah, well, in Jewish tradition, they were kept on scrolls, and prophets talk about the scrolls. Who's the famous prophet that ate a scroll? Can't
Wasn't
remember.
it Jeremiah?
Jeremiah, yeah. So obviously within Judaism, they were in scrolls. The papyri that we have for the New Testament, papyrus was easy to make, or relatively easy to make in Egypt, and that became common. And it was during the time of the Roman Empire that what are known as codices, the codex, the book, the thing that's got a spine, a binding, a cover, and then pages that you open up. And that's what we're used to. That's when that became current. So from the 3rd, 4th century onwards, we find biblical texts in codices. But the first full collection of Hebrew codex is, as I've indicated, from the year 1008. So it's a long, slowly evolving process. So there were texts around, but the collection is a much later entity.
So the Dead Sea Scrolls Library may have been earlier than the Middle Ages.
But but those books were still in Jewish form, still on individual scrolls.
Yes.
Collected scrolls, yeah.
And the way that we've received these traditions, it's important to remember all of those papyrus and those scrolls were in little tiny pieces. The first job of a text critic is be a jigsaw puzzle master and actually piece them all back together again before they can even think about deciphering what's written on them.
Okay. So a very simple example from Psalm 22. For dogs have surrounded me, a band of evildoers has encompassed me, they pierced my hands and my feet. That's the New American Standard Bible. Now, the Jewish Publication Society has published the Tanakh, the Hebrew scriptures, and this is the translation that they give from the text that they are using. Dogs surround me, a pack of evil one closes in on me. Like lions, they maul my hands and feet. So tiny variations. Perhaps the most significant one is instead of they pierce my hands and feet, like lions, they maul my hands and feet. Not a hugely significant change, but that gives you an example, one small example of what textual variation is like. Here's another example. In the Masoretic text, the Hebrew text, Goliath is 6 cubits and 1 span tall. Now, I confess I got this from an American website, so it's using feet and inches. If you still remember feet and inches, 6 cubits and 1 span is 9 foot 6 inches, which is pretty mighty tall, isn't it? In the Septuagint, Goliath is 4 cubits and 1 span tall, which is 6 foot 6 inches. Now that is also the reading in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and also Josephus, a historian of the late 1st, early 2nd century, quotes this text, and that's the version that he gives. So the question is, how do we assess this? What do you think is most likely to have been the original text?
So which is the earliest translation, or which is the earliest?
Which do you think is the most original?
Masoretic text.
Okay, and why do you think that, Greg?
Because the Septuagint is the Greek that was translated from the Hebrew, which is the Masoretic text.
Okay. So just looking at logically what should have been chronologically written first.
Yeah.
Yeah. What else might you use to assess this? How many sources say 6 foot 6?
3.
3.
3. How many sources say 9 foot 6?
1.
If you were getting witnesses of a car accident, would you go with the 3 that agreed or the 1 that didn't?
Good point.
3 that agreed.
Probably you would. So that's another factor.
We're talking about which one's the earliest one, though. Didn't I read somewhere that the ones with the most difficult text are most likely to be the earliest because the scribes corrected along the way. So
you read that in our student workbook, Kerry?
Yes, that's
I
where
read
it is.
So couldn't that one be the earlier one, even though it's got something in it that's unbelievable? So
Does the Bible have anything else that's unbelievable in it?
Yeah. Oh, lots of stuff.
Did people really live till they were 739?
Yeah, I believe that.
Was it
So
mad?
there's some things you can judge this. I think the point we're making is you can work out plausibly what would have been maybe the original using various criteria, but the bottom line is you're not going to know exactly.
Well, with people living till a certain age, doesn't it say in, I forget where it is, that God became, couldn't put up with men any longer, so he let them live to 70.
Yeah.
I don't know about that. There are some things in there where God did change things around because he wasn't happy with them. But I guess measuring that scientifically, do you know anyone who's ever lived that long?
No, but I reckon it's possible.
Maybe.
I have a question about plausibility.
Yeah.
And I mean, the Bible is filled with, virgin births, water into wine, people walking on water. Like, how do you know when to apply logic and plausibility in some instances, and whether, that's just my question.
That's a good question. I mean, one of the things you might like to consider, for example, is what we've found archaeologically, what we know about cultures and contexts. Things like miracles of healing and other sorts of miracles were actually noted down and quite much more common than you probably think in the New Testament. And there's lots of people that appear to have been doing them. So we know those kinds of things were happening and were believed by people in that age. If we dig up tombs and skeletons and other manuscripts, we're not digging up bones that usually are 700 years old, and we're not digging up 9-foot tall people, and we're not finding evidence outside of the biblical text that these things were ever known or ever noted. So when you can't find it anywhere else and there's nothing that might confirm it from another source, it's probably reasonable to be suspicious that you're dealing with some hyperbole, and that's put there for a reason.
In this particular case, we've been interpreting a cubit as 18 inches. Was it really as strict as that, or is it some sort of length from the elbow to the hand or something like that?
Yeah, it was.
Was it really 18 inches?
It was close.
Aren't we applying a different sort of rule here? Like, we're trying to apply a Western way of trying to prove the facts of these things, when the truth of it might be in the story itself rather than the detail.
Yeah, absolutely, Bill. Yeah. And we're just pointing out that texts don't always agree with each other, and sometimes it's not important, like this one, and sometimes it is important.
So don't you just take the oldest? I mean, what's the scholarly thing to do here? Is it just to take the oldest text, or?
No, it's to weigh up all the evidence.
All the evidence.
Yeah. Is there multiple sources, etc.?
While you've been wrangling this question, people, I took up John Butler's challenge, and I'm going to reveal now that I've completely misremembered this, but this is relevant to the dating. The Septuagint was actually created when Ptolemy II was ruler, and he was in the 3rd century before the Common Era. He ruled from 283 to 246. And so there's a legend that he actually asked 70 scholars to come together and make the translation. The story is told in the letter of Aristeas, which is from the late 3rd century, maybe the beginning of the 2nd century BCE. So in that sense, the Septuagint is translating a Hebrew text from the 3rd century. The Dead Sea Scrolls are reflecting a Hebrew text from the 2nd century or 1st century, and Josephus is reflecting a Hebrew text from the late 1st century. The Masoretes were actually active in the Middle Ages, from the 7th to the 11th century of the Common Era. So the text that we have, we don't know exactly when the dating is, but it's from that period, which is 700 years after Jesus.
Yeah, that's right.
So that the Masoretic text, if you compare the Hebrew originals lying behind those other three, the Masoretic text is much older. Okay, let's go on. In your books, there is an exercise, visual variants of 2 Samuel 13, verse 21. And we can, maybe Elizabeth will just do this as a plenary group, do you think?
Yep, that's fine.
It's a fairly short exercise. You have a look at those 4 on page 28. Have a look at, you can see the 2 key principles of text criticism on the top, and then you can see 4 options for translating a verse in 2 Samuel. And I should say that all of them have the verses that surround this, but the NRSV translation down the bottom gives you those verses just to give you the context. But it's actually verse 21 that we're looking at. So the question is, who we think was more likely to have been the original text, the Masoretic text or another version?
Septuagint's the oldest.
Beg your pardon, John?
I think the Septuagint's the oldest text, and then the Dead Sea Scroll one.
Yes.
And then the Masoretic's the youngest text.
That doesn't make it the most accurate text.
No, it doesn't. But I'm saying that's what it's. That's just one thing to consider.
So the Masoretic text just says that when King David heard about Amnon and Tamar, he was furious.
He must have been a prime minister then.
Well,
He proceeded to do nothing.
That statement's consistent in both of them, so that's much as consistent.
Yes, that's consistent. So the prime minister was furious no matter what.
Yeah.
But what did he, prime minister / king, do?
Not much.
Yeah. And
Right.
the other 2 are consistent.
Yeah.
Actually.
So the others give an explanation.
Yeah.
He didn't want to inflict pain on Amnon because he loved him. He was his firstborn.
So the Masoretic text is a summary.
Yeah, the Masoretic text leaves you to ponder. What did he do with his fury? Doesn't tell you.
No.
Also, would he have done that if it was his firstborn daughter?
Yes. She's a daughter. Let's get this straight. She counts for nothing, or not much anyway.
That's a worry.
Of course it's a worry. And
So-
she is avenged by her brother Absalom, not by her father.
So for some reason, the Masoretic text seems to have omitted this explanation.
Did it ever have it?
Well, yeah, or else it just knew another version that didn't have it.
Yep.
Because the sources aren't going to necessarily be the same for these different versions.
No,
That's
that's right.
Oh, no.
So you can see that the NRSV has taken the option of including the longer version of that verse and hasn't followed the Masoretic text, the Hebrew text. All right, these were just a few small examples of text criticism. Well, the other thing to say about 2 Samuel is both 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel are rife with all of these kinds of variations. And if you have a study Bible that has footnotes that tells you, makes comments about the text, you may find again and again throughout 1 and 2 Samuel especially, a little annotation that says, meaning of Hebrew is uncertain. So the translators, reliant on the text critics, the translators have to make a decision, how are we going to render this in a way that makes sense when it's read in church or when people are reading it for their devotions?
Or do you think that they changed it because it was an unpleasant subject?
Sure, yeah, I think the unpleasant subject censoring comes into the process. Yeah.
You will meet the ultimate censor of the Old Testament in this course, the chronicler. He censors lots.
We're going to move from text to translation now, and Elizabeth will lead us through this.
You can see on page 29, there's a list of current 20th century English translations. Some of them are based on texts like the Greek and the Hebrew or the Masoretic. And some of them you can see are actually from another translation. The Jerusalem Bible, for instance, is from a French translation. And the King James Bible came from the Latin Vulgate. So it was based on a Latin translation. Now, in all of these Bibles, and I encourage you, if you have a Bible with an introduction, to read it, because they'll tell you why they're doing this Bible and how they set about translating it. All of these Bibles fall into two kind of camps. One is what we call formal correspondence, and that emphasises the source or the text. And what they try and do in a formal correspondence is translate one word for one word. So they try and get the closest, most accurate translation for the Greek and Hebrew they can possibly find. And the NIV and the NRSV are two examples of a formal correspondence. Dynamic equivalents are Bibles that feel that some terms need a bit more unpacking, and they'll give you a few words or a little phrase to actually explain a word or a situation. And they're like a paraphrase. They're known as dynamic equivalent. That is, they're equivalent to the intention of the text, but they're doing it in a more maybe user-friendly or modern way. And examples of that are books like the New Jerusalem Bible, or the Good News Bible is a really good example of that. A really bad example of that is the Living Bible, which is not so much as a paraphrase as a complete invention, but it does have some similarities to the text, not many, because it adds so many things. It's not just paraphrasing it, it actually adds things that aren't there. The Message is another modern dynamic equivalent Bible. So everyone understand that concept?
What was the after the Good News Bible and the New Jerusalem Bible? What was the other one?
I said the Living Bible. Don't read the Living Bible because it adds things. It adds heaps of things that aren't in the text at all. So I'm not a fan of it, and I don't recommend it for that reason. But if you look at the introductions to each of these Bibles, you can see that they'll explain what they're doing. And they'll tell you, for example, if there's a choice of translation, they've got 2 or 3 choices for a Hebrew or Greek word. For instance, the NIV will tell you it will choose the most evangelical conservative word because they're an evangelical conservative Bible. And they're quite upfront about it. Doesn't mean their translation's not accurate. They just mean they'll skew a certain way. And all translators do this, as we're about to discover. So we're going to move to page 30 now. And we're going to look at a Hebrew word, Satan. And it's a word you'll all be familiar with, and you're going to be even more familiar with it by the end of this. And we're going to have a look at how it should be translated. It can mean a number of things. As you can see, John has listed up angel, advocate, or adversary. It can also be accuser. It can be enemy. Like a lot of Hebrew words and Greek words, it's got multiple connected meanings. So we'll be looking at it today. Now, the ha at the front of Satan is just the in Hebrew, T-H-E. And Hebrew reads from right to left. So that funny looking horseshoe with the hole in it in the left-hand top corner, that's a ha. And that is the. So when we want to make a the in Hebrew, we stick one of these in front. The thing that looks like a W is the S. The thing that looks like a sort of squished circle with a gap at the top is the T, and the stroke at the end is the N. And you can see that there's tiny little things underneath it. There's things that look like tiny capital T's, and there's a dash, and that is the vowels. That's a pointed version of ha-satan that you're looking at there. And the word Satan just comes from this Hebrew noun. And all that's happened is translators have just taken the Hebrew letters and made them English letters. So you get S-A-T-N. That's what it says in Hebrew, and that's what it becomes in English if you just copy it into English. So it's not a translation, it's what's called a transliteration, where we just put the letters into the letters of our language. So we're going to be exploring this character today and see what it should be translated as. And it's a really good example of translators not always doing the right thing. So I want you to look at 1 Kings 5, and your books are incorrect. You'll need to change them if you've got a pen. It's 1 Kings 5:4. It's 1 Kings 11:14. It's 1 Kings 11:23, not 5:23. And it's 1 Kings 11:25. And I'm going to pop you into small groups for a few minutes to read those translations and actually come up with which word you think is translating Satan. So I'm going to open your rooms now. Yeah, we're all in. I don't know how the well bands will go with this.
Yeah. Yes, I'll do the roll document.
Okay. Now you've got the numbers one up next, haven't you?
Yeah, I forgot to add in Balaam, but we
can just have a look at that. And once they've done this exercise, if you've got the quote up there, we'll just look at it.
The Balaam one?
Yes, please.
I'll have to find it, just a minute.
Okay. It's just interesting because it's the only one where he's an angel.
Yeah. Looks like they've closed the. Where is? Do you remember where it is in Balaam? Oh, I'll search for Balaam. That's all right.
Just look for Balaam numbers. It's in Numbers.
Yeah, yeah. I'm ready to go to bed, I think.
Oh, are you? Oh dear. Balaam's donkey. There he is.
Yeah, yeah. It's Numbers 22. And how is it translated as an angel?
Yes, make sure you've got the NRSV.
Yeah, I've got, that's all, the only one I've got on.
Yeah.
I've got a full version of it. That's what I search.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
it wants to go blank on me.
Numbers 22.
You want to find the right verse?
Yes, I will. Oh, it's New King James. That's handy. It's the first one I clicked on. Balaam, the donkey and the angel. It's verse 22 and 23.
Oh, yeah.
And
The angel of the Lord, yeah.
It should say, stood there as his way as an adversary. The angel of the Lord took his stand in the way as an adversary.
Adversary?
Against him. Yeah. Has it got the word adversary?
Yes.
Good, because the NIV leaves that out. I'll change that. I'll look at the NIV and have a look, but I'm pretty sure it leaves it out altogether because it can't cope with it. Bible Gateway, where's the NIV? There it is. It just says God was angry when he went and the angel of the Lord stood in the road to oppose him. So they just eliminate the word completely in the NIV. It ain't there at all. Which I always found interesting, that they felt the need to do that.
Yeah. All right, I'll put the NIV in as well.
Yep, that's a good, and we'll just have a quick look at it. I think it's not a bad little comparison, because I'm making the point that if you're not capitalising him as S, if he's obviously in some other role, we're going to get rid of him. I just think this is an important text for these people. We've got a couple of conservatives in this lot, not just Derek, who's used to me. All right, I'll check the rooms are starting to close now.
Oh, God. All right, well, I've got a slide that's got the two of them.
Okay. Now, do you think we need to put them into rooms for the next one, or should they just look at that chart and look at where Satan and other things are being used?
No, we can do that if you wish, yeah.
It might save a bit of time.
Well, you'll just lead them through that, talking about that.
Yeah, and that way we might have more time for Isaiah. Okay.
Got out.
There they are, coming back in. Okay, did we all find the word that was translating Satan?
Yeah.
Mostly.
Well, they're all over the place.
Okay. And what words were normally translating Satan in these passages?
Adversary.
Adversary, that was the most common.
Yes.
Now, and John's got them up here for you to have a look at. This is from the NRSV, and yes, I think we've got adversary everywhere. Are these adversaries named?
Some of them are, yeah.
Some of them are. Who are they?
Hadad, the Edomite.
Yep. Are they enemies or friends of Solomon and Israel?
Enemies.
They're enemies. So the word Satan is a normal Hebrew word to describe an enemy.
That's what it says here.
So that's our first point we want to make. The word Satan is a common Hebrew noun that means enemy or adversary. It can mean, in a court setting, accuser. And you can see that these are human beings who are being called Satan.
Yeah. I think we'd sort of come to that in our group, that it wasn't an entity.
No, it's not an entity. Now we're going to have another look at another place where the word Satan occurs, and we're going to look at how two translations deal with it. This is Numbers 22. And the two translations up there, the first one is the NRSV and the second one is the NIV. Now, can you tell me where Satan is and who the Satan is in the first one?
The angel of the Lord.
The angel of the Lord is a what?
Adversary.
It's a Satan. So That word adversary is translating Satan. So this Malachim, which is the word for angel, this Malachim is standing in the road as a Satan.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Now have a look at what the NIV does. Can you tell me where the word Satan is? What's translating it?
Balaam.
No.
The angel. Angel.
The angel of the Lord, yes, that's there. What's missing?
Adversary.
Adversary is
Yeah.
missing. The NIV is completely not.
To oppose him instead.
They have not translated this word here. Why do you
Well,
think
that's
that is?
They've softened it down to oppose.
They have softened it down to a verb. The angel stood there to oppose him, but they haven't translated. Despite saying they're a formal correspondence translation, they have let themselves down and we failed to do that in this bit. Why do you think that is?
Doesn't suit their doctrine.
It does not suit their doctrine. That is spot on. It does not suit their doctrine. So the word has been eliminated completely, even though you would never know reading it in English. That's what it's translating in Hebrew. But they've gotten rid of it because for them, Satan is going to have a different meaning than what it actually does in the Hebrew, because they're looking at it through a Christian lens. Okay, Numbers 22 is an important little text to have a look. It's not dealing with whether we believe in angels or anything like that, but we're having a look at how it's translated, and that's why it's important. Now, what we're going to do now is have a look at page 31.
So with Satan, can that be a heavenly being?
We'll get to that. We're about to look at that right now, Jane, so I'm glad you asked that question. There's some questions there about page 31, and it's which translations never use the word Satan, and why do you think that is? And which verses always use it, and why do you think that is? For example, if we run our eyes across the 1 Samuel line, how is Satan being translated?
Adversary.
Adversary?
Yeah.
What about the NIV? What have they done with this word again?
Left,
yeah, that's right.
Muted it. Yeah.
Yeah. So they're saying he will turn against us. Again, they've used a verb to describe the Satan. So the best you've got adversary, and the NEB you have traitor in the battle, which is a sense of an enemy. And then you have turn against in the Common English Bible. So it's the sense, but not actually using the word. What about one king? And are they human people, these adversaries? Yes. Yes, they are. Okay, what about one kings? How is the translation working there? You've looked at this.
They're all using.
Well, it's the King
Even the
James.
NIV.
Is different. The King James is different. It's trying to give it a personification happens there.
It's given 2 bites of the cherry, actually.
Well, no, it hasn't. It's translating disaster as evil occurrence. So there's neither adversary, that's Satan, or an evil occurrence, where the others have said attack, misfortune, and disaster. So it can have multiple meanings, obviously, there. So we look at the NEB and you can see there's no one to oppose me. So again, it's become a verb there rather than translating the word. And what is the right word in the CB? What's translating Satan?
Enemies or
misfortune.
Yeah. So in the context of that, again, the Satans are human adversaries. Right. 1 Chronicles.
Satan or a heavenly adversary, or one that says heavenly adversary, let's say Satan.
Now in 1 Chronicles, it's Satan, it's not Ha-Satan, so it doesn't have a the or a definite article. If I read this as an enemy stood up against Israel and incited David to count the people, would it read accurately?
Yeah. Yes.
Yes, it would. Why did kings count their armies? Count their people, sorry.
see whether they had enough to defeat the enemy.
That's exactly right. You conduct a census and count the people when you suspect someone's going to attack you. So if this read an enemy stood up against Israel in this context, it would make perfect sense. So why has it got a capital S whacked on it? Whose idea was that?
The chronicler.
No, it's not the chronicler's idea. Let's make this clear. Hebrew doesn't have capital letters.
Okay.
Translator. The translator.
A translator has done this. And the question is this actually the right translation here?
Yes.
How
Good
else
point.
is everywhere? How else is Satan translated everywhere else you've just read?
Adversary. Enemy.
That's right, an enemy or an adversary.
Adversary.
Why has that word suddenly become the personified prince of evil?
Don't know.
Good question. That's right.
Question.
This is the curse of the metaphysical capital. This is when translators with a Christian lens anachronistically change what's in front of them. Okay, we'll come back to that in a minute. We're going to go to Job now because the Satan is different in the book of Job. So how is it translated in the book of Job?
Satan.
Satan, capital S, except for...
Yeah, all capital F.
No, not all capital S.
Except in the CEB.
Yes, the CEB has the adversary.
The capital
Now,
A. But with a capital A.
So Satan in Job is Ha-Satan. It's the Satan, so it's the Ha-Satan. So the first thing you might want to note is the 4 translations there have dropped his the. It should actually read then, before the Lord and that Satan also came among them. It probably doesn't make quite as much sense if you do that. So let's unpack a bit this presence and see who he is, because this is really one of the there's only 2 places this character actually is personified. This is one of them, Zechariah is the other one. So we have this adversary turns up. Now, where is he turning up? Where are they?
In the heavens before the Lord.
They're in the heavenly court. That's right, where God hangs out with the angels and the heavenly beings. So what does that tell you about the Satan, the Ha-Satan?
Is this terribly important?
It's part of the heavenly.
He's part of the heavenly beings.
Yes, he's part of the heavenly beings. And up he is, there he is, up there with the heavenly beings. Can he do what he likes, or does God always tell him what to do?
God's in charge.
God's in charge of him.
God is in charge. So this Ha-Satan is a heavenly being who presents himself before the Lord, and God can tell him what to do. So is he the personified prince of evil and darkness of the New Testament?
No.
No, he's not. He is not. He's different. So how might we translate him? When you translate him with a capital S like that, what do you immediately think of? He's a baddie. He's a baddie.
The evil one.
He is the evil one. But in this particular text, he's actually not the evil one. And if you know Job, you'd know he has a job. He's the accuser and the adversary. His job is he's been roving around and he comes to report to God, and God says, did you see Job? He's so righteous. And the Ha-Satan says, yes, but does he only worship you because he has lots of goodies? You know, you've made his life very comfortable. Why would he not worship you? And God says, fair point. You can test him. And that's exactly what he goes off and does. And then he comes back and we repeat this scene, and God says, I told you, he's a very faithful. And the Satan says, come on, you just took away his stuff. What if you actually attack his body? And God again says, fair point. You can attack his body, but don't kill him. So off goes the Satan, the adversary or the accuser, and that's exactly what he does. And then the whole book of Job then plays out from that point. So probably the CEB is much closer to how it should be translated. It should be the accuser or the adversary. Even devil's advocate would be a better translation or a paraphrase of what's actually intended in the book of Job. This is not the devil as we understand it in Christian terminology.
The NIV has a note that said, am I on?
Yep.
The NIV has a note that calls Satan the accuser and says that's what it is. So if you read the footnote in the NIV, it says an accuser.
Well, I'm glad the NIV does that, but it should have actually put it in the translation and not the footnote, I would contend, because that is what the translation actually says. The accuser comes with the other heavenly beings. So when you put a capital S on that, it leads you to think of something straight away that actually is not in the text. Why am I doing this? I'm telling you this because translators take the liberty with text and they will impose Christian viewpoints onto text where it was never intended to be. Okay, let's look at the next one, Psalm 109. So what's going on here?
It's because publishers have to sell Bibles, Elizabeth.
And you think it needs a Satan and a baddie to sell it? Is that what you're saying? You think there's not enough baddies in there already? Gee.
Well, like you only have to look at today's NIV that didn't sell because of the way it handled some words.
That's true, actually. With certain denominations, they can get very picky about that. And the NIV knows it because, as I think it was,
that hand behind
it was, where is she? Anne, that said her NIV has a footnote saying it's actually the accuser, and they're right, it is. But that's not how they've translated it.
Well, that's on my can't mute.
And they know it. So if we look at Psalm 109:6, what are we translating there mainly? What's the word being used?
Accuser.
It's accuser, except for King James, who wants to again put that capital letter there and turn this word in from a noun into something quite different. Now, Zechariah is the only other place where you have the bloke from Job, it seems, back again. And it's the Hasatan, and the Hasatan is standing at the right hand to accuse him. And if you know Zechariah, this is a court of law. So the NEB and the CEB translated as adversary. Accuser would also be quite an acceptable translation. But it is not, again, Satan as Christians understand it. It's not the devil, prince of darkness. It is that Hebrew word again, Hasatan. So an accuser is standing at the right hand to accuse Zechariah, and then he's banished by God. And it's probably the same one. So you might give him a capital, but you'd capitalise his A. He'd be the capital A accuser or the capital A adversary. But he's not that Christian understanding of Satan. So this has just been an exploration for you to show that there's actually some really important issues around translations. And different Bibles will make different decisions around translations about what they're prepared to actually influence you about. I'm never happy about this personally because I think they should think you've got the native good sense to make up your own minds with some things. Now let's turn over the page because we're going to have one more place where we're looking at the Satan. And we've already looked at this. But what we're going to do now is compare it where it came from. The chronicler uses a source, and fortunately, we have this source. The chronicler takes the books of Kings and Samuel, and he actually uses them and he rewrites them to a large degree. And John's got the two versions up there. So you'll find in 2 Samuel 24, in verse 1, it says, "The anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, 'Go count the people of Israel and Judah.'" So who's responsible in Samuel for getting David counting?
The Lord.
The Lord is. The chronicler, however, when he tells this story, tells it differently. He says, the Satan, an enemy or an adversary, an accuser, Satan stood against Israel and incited David to count the people of Israel. So we've got a shift here.
Are you encouraged that the Lord is just not an angelic being?
No, not when it's written like that. When it's written
No.
like that, see how it's got caps? It's in
Yeah.
capitals. You may not know this, but what that indicates in the translation, it's a tetragrammaton. The tetragrammaton is a very long word to say it's got the consonants of Yahweh and the vowels of Adonai, which is the Hebrew word for Lord. And the reason that was invented by the Hebrew people was to stop people pronouncing the true name of the Lord, which was forbidden. So it's not an angel. It's actually, when we see the tetragrammaton, it's God. And it's to stop you saying his name. It's just one of these peculiar things in the Old Testament. So we have the chronicler here has changed it. Why?
The chronicler might not have wanted to pose God as opposing Israel. That was not politically correct.
Yes, by the chronicler's time, we don't want God getting angry and inciting David to do something that the Lord then punishes him for, because that seems rather counterproductive, really, when you think about it. So the chronicler is telling a much more straightforward story. He's saying an adversary or an enemy stands up against Israel, and that incites David to count the people, which is perfectly logical. And it takes the Lord right out of that mix.
So you, so you're saying the version is the same?
Yes.
And which version is it, or doesn't matter?
The Book of Chronicles retells the stories from the books of Samuel.
But the word is the same, would be the same.
No.
But when Chronicles was written, you're saying that they changed the word.
Yes. Chronicles alters the Book of Samuel. It censors it. It doesn't just censor this part, it censors heaps of it.
Right.
You will look to your eyes bleed to find Bathsheba in the Book of Chronicles. He just eliminates her completely.
So why does he do that?
Good question, fair and to the point. It's all to do with when you're writing, what your context is, how you view divinity, because in the centuries or so that's occurred here between 2 Samuel's writing and 1 Chronicles, things have changed. So the chronicler retells the story to suit his context. It's the same story. Look at verse 3. But Joab said to the king, or Joab said, may the Lord increase the number of his people 100-fold. Well, it's the same thing. He just rearranges it.
Excuse me, Elizabeth, Chronicles though is written 200 years later.
That's exactly right. That's what I'm saying.
Yep.
He's changed the Book of Samuel.
Yeah. And all of them are about 800 years after the event.
Yes. But my point is he's got a source in front of him and he alters it.
That's a little naughty, isn't it?
No, because that's what Jews do.
They're allowed to interpret.
It's about interpretation. It's about a midrashic view. You tell the stories of your people in a way that relates to your era and your culture at the time. So things change in Scripture. Things evolve in Scripture, and the evolving between Samuel and the Chronicles is quite profound at certain parts.
It's like if you were telling the Samuel story in a nursing home, you would tell it at a level that they would understand.
You'd probably use the Chronicles version and not the Samuel, unexpurgated Samuel version.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
But
all
also,
of this is
also, Elizabeth, we got to think about how we even edit previous texts from even 30 years ago.
Exactly.
What we do today is updated.
That's right. As we find new discoveries and new texts and new information becomes available, we do that, Gary. That's exactly what we do. The point of this exercise has been to say that when translators do things like add a capital S and they drop the definite article, you get a very different impression created. And the choice of translators to do that probably reflects their Christian and theological bias. That's all right, but you need to be aware of some of those changes because it influences how you read the text, and it may influence you to read it in a way that isn't actually a good way. The choice of words of translators shouldn't be just accepted at face value, and I suggest that all of you, if you don't have one, invest in a good study Bible with footnotes. So you can note there on page 32, I've got Satan. It's a noun, it's masculine, it's adversary, accuser, opponent, and it can be national or personal. And if you put that funny little thing in front of it, it's the Satan, the Hasatan. How this Hasatan, or how the Lord and this Hasatan are going to play out over the centuries, is reflected in what the chronicler starts. Because the chronicler starts something, he starts shifting the blame off the Lord. And by the time of the New Testament, you've got a God described as a God of love, and all that evil stuff has been shifted onto the devil or Satan. And there's actually an evolution in our texts that you can pinpoint and track through that starts here at this point. And I just think that's an interesting point to note. And there's some questions you can think about is when translators do this, how does it shape scripture, and how does it shape the way you read it, then preach on it? If you think that's Satan, the personified prince of darkness in Chronicles, you will preach a different sermon than if you think it's an enemy of Israel. If you see my point, translation is important.
So at what sort of time frame did the shift happen from Satan being just an adversary to being like a personification of evil?
Oh, it was quite a few hundred years. And you see the rise of it in what we call the intertestamental period. That's the period between the end of the Old Testament canon, but before the New Testament's written down. And there's a lot of apocalyptic literature in that period. And he starts to appear there. And he's pitched from, maybe he's developed from Job. And he's taken as an adversary from the book of Job, but gradually over time, he becomes like opposed to God. And then you read mythologies about him being a former angel. Well, they've got that from Job and from Numbers, and that he was fallen because he fell out with God and had a big argument with him or wanted to take power. And so God cast him out. So he's doomed then to wander the earth in his dark angelic form, creating chaos. So there's an evolution in the story, and it develops over that period. So by the time of the New Testament, we have the devil or Diabolos, or we have the Satan, and he's kept his name. He's still the Satan. He's kept it. But he has by that stage become the personified prince of evil, as you see in the story of the Temptations, for example.
Elizabeth, what you've just said, is that the basis for your dating the book of Job quite late?
I don't know that I would date Job late. I would probably date it later than the really early period, but not necessarily, because you can have an early text that late writers grab and develop. So, no, not really. Any other questions on that? I mean, scripture evolves and context evolves, and how translators will translate it will evolve. All of these things are shifting. They're not set in concrete, as it were, literally.
Elizabeth, can you just clarify, when you've used the word translators, you're looking at the Chronicles, right?
No, no, I'm talking about your Bible, the Bible translators.
Yes, okay, but how Chronicles was actually reinterpreted Samuel is a reality. I don't know how you, there needs to be careful which one you're talking about, don't we?
When I use translator, I'm talking about people who translate the text into your Bibles.
Into English.
Okay, right.
Okay.
Yeah.
The chronicler is not a translator, he's an editor.
That's okay. That's what I think. I just would like to be, that's what I think is very different.
Yeah, it is. But he started something.
Yeah.
This would be really interesting if you were translating into Spanish because of El Dios.
Yes.
God. Yeah.
Well, you'd find it harder because it wouldn't go in letter for letter in the same way. So, yes, it would be trickier. Okay. The last thing we have there is translations of Isaiah, and we've run out of time again. But we'll have a quick look at it. And what we're going to ask you to do is we'll put you into groups for just 5 minutes, we want you to look at some, and I'll give each group one or two of them to look at, not the whole lot. Have a look at the divine name that's used in verse 3. And have a look at the description of who's in the heavenly court in attendance in verses 2. So that's looking at the divine name in verse 3 and the description of the attendance in verse 2. Group 1, you can look at the Isaiahs on page 33. Group 2, you can look at the 2 Isaiahs on the top of page 34. That's the NASB and the NLT. If Group 3 can take Isaiah, the Message, and the Jewish Publication Society Bible, and Group 4 can do the Jewish Publication Society Bible and the New Jerusalem Bible. Are you all clear who you are looking at in your groups?
How do we know our group number?
I don't know which group.
We don't know our group number, yeah.
Doesn't it tell you?
Yeah, room 2.
It tells you room 1 has John and Ann Sutton in it.
Oh.
So if you're in that group, room 2 has David Webb and Janice in it, and Gwyn and Gary. Room 3 has Greg Haney, Jen and Maxine in it, and room 4 is Bill Lang et al.
Okay, so now we know our rooms. Could you repeat what you just?
Yes, room 1 can do Isaiah on page 33, so that's the NIV and the NRSV. Room 2 can do the NASB and the NLT on page 34. Room 3 can do the Message and the Jewish Publication Society Bible, and room 4 can do the Jewish Publication Society Bible and the New Jerusalem Bible. Correct. What did we find about the divine name in verse 3? Is it the same in the text that you looked at?
No.
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 No. And if you,
and I think part of it is because the Hebrews can't pronounce the name Yahweh, so they had to do a substitution.
Yes. So
Okay.
how does that work its way out, Dorothea?
Well, the Hashem is a referral to God, but it's not using the term Yahweh.
Yeah, so in the Jewish Publication Bible, Hashem means the name.
Yeah.
So it just says holy, holy is the name of hosts. So it doesn't say God or the Lord or Yahweh. That's quite right. And Jews, you notice down in verse 8, will have a dash where the Lord is. So this is their way of trying not to pronounce or write the name of the secret name of the Lord of hosts. You don't say it. So the Jewish publication is quite a unique way of doing it in that sense.
There also seems to be variation in whether it's just God or God and his armies.
Yes, that's a really good point. Now, if you look down at the New Jerusalem Bible in verse 3, you'll say it says Yahweh Sabaoth, which is literally Yahweh is like the Lord, it's usually said, or Yahweh. And then Sabaoth is hosts. So that is just transliterating, the same way people transliterated the letters of Satan into Satan. The New Jerusalem Bible has just transliterated the Hebrew straight into English letters. So that's literally what it says. Now, when you say hosts in the ancient world, what does it conjure up? What can it mean?
The host of angels.
It could be a host of angels. What else can it be?
Well, the whole of creation, I think.
Well, it can, but not in this context. An army, that's it.
An
It
army.
can be an army.
The host.
So when you look at the New Living Translation, you've got there the Lord of Heaven's armies,
Yeah.
because it's a dynamic equivalent, so it's telling you. And if you look at the Message, it's holy, holy is the God of the angel armies.
Oh.
So when you look at that word for host, it could be either of those things. It could be heaven's armies, or it could just be armies, or there might be some angels in the armies.
It's an army of
That's right. And some just say the Lord of hosts, like the NRSV, because that's what the Hebrew says. And the NIV goes a little bit funny. It just uses the Lord Almighty. So it just ignores the hosts and says, I guess he's Almighty over host, and that's unspelled out. Anyway, so you can see this is a tricky piece of Hebrew, and for various reasons, translators are using different translations of those same words, and they don't mean the same. The Lord Almighty is not the same words as the Lord of hosts of the Lord of angelic armies.
No.
Yeah, and don't you think, Elizabeth, but they do tend to reflect those translations were pitched like the New American Standards, pitched towards a broader Catholic framing of
quite possibly. Translators do this. They pitch to their audiences. They do, and they tell you they do if you read the introductions to their Bibles. They're very honest about it. Okay, let's look at the attendance in verse 2. Who's around the Lord?
Seraphs.
We have seraphs. Some of them have seraphs. What else do you have?
Both six.
Seraphim.
God knows.
You have seraphim. Yeah.
Angel seraphs.
Angel seraphs. I think that's it. That's all of them. So what is the correct one? What is going on with this translation?
Well, two we looked at were the same.
Are they all correct? Are they all wrong? Is one of them right?
Does anybody know?
Yes, there is an answer to this.
Okay.
Well, seraphim is just the Hebrew plural. So this is, again, a transliteration from the Hebrew. So seraphim is the male singular plural, I think. No, it's, the male plural for seraph. So seraphs is the English way of writing it. We make a plural by sticking an S on the end. And in Hebrew, they stick an I-M on the end. So seraphim, cherubim, Elohim, they're all plural, masculine plural. So in those cases, seraphim is just saying the Hebrew plural, and seraphs is saying the English plural. Angel seraphs are just spelling out the bleeding obvious, that they're in heaven and they're probably angelic. And that's the message, who is, again, a dynamic equivalent. So it's explaining to the uninitiated reader who doesn't know a seraph from a cherub that it's an angel, it's an angelic creature, and that's why that has been added in there. Now, if you look at the pronouns in verse 2, you'll see they're different. Sometimes it's above him were seraphim, each with 6 wings. They covered their faces, they covered their feet. And it's the same in the NIV. But if you have a look in the Jewish Publication Bible, it's stood the seraphim. Each one had 6 wings, and he covered his face and he covered his feet and he could fly. That is actually the more correct. It is in the singular masculine, but in the interests of being inclusive, the NIV and the NRSV have just made them a collective, so they're they, which becomes sexless as they were, but they're not sexless. And my Tuggeranong people should be able to tell you there's a euphemism in verse 2. What is it, good Tuggeranong people? What is the euphemism in verse 2?
Feet.
The feet. And what are the feet?
The genitals.
The genitals, yes. In Hebrew, feet is a euphemism for genitals. So angels, you might have thought they were sexless. They're not. Seraphim have genitals, which they cover with their wings.
Right.
You didn't know that, did you? That's a bit exciting.
I don't know what to do with that, Elizabeth.
Well, you apply it to the book of Ruth, where Ruth says, Ruth uncovered Boaz's feet.
Yeah.
Think about it.
Got it. Okay.
I often wondered what that signified, but I must say none of that will go down well in a church sermon.
No. Well, you never know, it might.
Well, I've actually stuck it in a sermon.
I can't see it going.
Hands up, Tuggeranong people who have heard me say this. That should be nearly all of you, most of you, because I've told you. So I don't worry about it, and I tell the congregation these dreadful things.
With 2, he covered his ears.
Well, I mean, when they were getting the temple ready, and they were making all the laws and things like that. When the priest was to go to the into the holy place, he had to make sure that he had underwear on.
That's right. You cover them. Exactly.
Yeah.
And he
Very
was
important.
But you don't put them on your feet.
When he bent over, he wasn't allowed to show his genitals.
They've got, and I mean, the Dead Sea Scrolls are even more strict on this. And the Dead Sea Scrolls are one of the reasons we know that feet is a euphemism in Hebrew for genitals, because it's quite explicit in the Dead Sea Scrolls that that is what's happening. So this is widely accepted by scholars. It's just a fun fact that I horrify people with. It doesn't change the meaning of the text, but Hebrew, like English, uses euphemisms. This is one of them. I'm pointing it out because it's the first one I think we've met.
I find it interesting in the easy to read version, which the Bible League translates to make it in simpler English for prisoners, that they say there each angel has 6 wings. They use 2 wings to cover their faces. Which is rather strange. It's different to feet or genitals. I don't know what their thoughts there was, how prisoners would have interpreted that when they read the Bible.
I really don't know. And the seraphim are very fierce. They appear in a number of places doing bad things usually. If God sends a plague, it's the seraphim who deliver it. The malachim, which is another class of angel, they're the messengers. They're the ones that turn up at Abraham's tent and climb up and down Jacob's ladder and do that kind of thing. That's the malachim. The seraphim are in the heavenly court. They bring plagues and other nasties down. And then you've got the cherubim, and the cherubim actually form the throne of God, and God sits on them.
How did the cherubim get associated with love?
Good question. Fair and to the point, given God sits on them and that's their function to form his throne. I think people started drawing them as little fluffy creatures with tiny wings, and they got mixed up with Cupid.
Oh, okay, yeah.
The little god of love of the Hellenistic religions. And I think there was a conflation there between the cherubim and Cupid. And they ended up all looking like Cupid, where when you read descriptions of what they're doing in the Psalms and the prophets, they're the throne of God. He sits on them, and that's their role. So
there was 3, seraphim, cherubim. What was the third one?
The malachim.
But why have we got them? Is it really we can't deal with the dark side of God?
No, we can't.
No.
I'm just stating that as a fact, John. No, we can't.
That's right.
Yeah.
That to me, as a scientist, is terribly important.
Elizabeth, I have read Elizabeth, I have read the notes on Ruth from the NIV, and I would never get the euphemism for uncovering feet from it.
No, you won't in the NIV.
No.
I really won't.
I promise you'll get it when I teach Ruth in this course in a whenever it
I
happens.
don't doubt you. I don't
Yeah.
doubt you. I'm talking about the footnotes.
Yes.
Ruth is not what it seems.
No.
It is not the little fluffy fairy book you probably all think it is. Trust me.
I'm surprised. It's
Never
so
think it was, but it makes more sense.
It does make much more sense.
Yeah.
She perfumes herself. She puts on her best clothes. She does all of this ritual getting ready. She's going to seduce him, not sit at his feet. And there's all sorts of things in there that just reading the English in Ruth you won't get. You need to understand the Hebrew, and I'm very obliging, and I'll unpack that for you when we get it. So, John, do you want to finish up with the homework? We have homework for you. It's not a lot. We just want you to read. We didn't cover about the Pentateuch.
Oh, the Pentateuch.
Yes.
Very hard to get a euphemism.
Yeah, so on page 36 through to page 40, there's a little bit of a review and a little bit of more information about the Pentateuch. So it would be helpful if you could read that through, and we'll kind of take it as assumed that you have, because next week we're going to start at the beginning in session 4 with Genesis 1 and 2 and 3. And we'll be looking at creation and primeval history, and also a little bit about Noah and flood stories. So we'll be grappling. So if you read through those pages and you find yourself at a loss and there's more time that you have in the week, you could actually read chapters 1 to 11 of Genesis if you wanted to.
1 to 11, okay.
1 to 11. So that's for next week.
Okay.
Okay, any
Such a
final
good group.
questions?
Such a lot of interaction in this group. It's great.
The comment I'd like to make is I always liked the NIV 2011 because it was more recent. I now feel a bit disillusioned about it, but also wondering, I mean, the NRSV is rather much older translation now, 30 years old. Is there any newer translation which can be considered more reliable or authoritative than the NRSV or the NIV?
English Standard Version.
Well, the New Living Translation is 1996. I think that's the most recent.
It's not bad.
Yeah.
Like all translations, it's got its biases and flaws, but long as you read the introduction and understand them, that's not an issue. I'm not saying translations are all bad and awful. You just need to be aware they've got biases. And I encourage all of you to read the introduction to your translations you like and understand what those translators were trying to achieve and who their target audience was, because that does skew how they do it. And that's okay, long as they're upfront about it.
I think the Common English Bible is fairly recent.
Oh, the Common English Bible, yes.
Yes.
That's actually
I think it's 2004.
92.
Yeah. Or you could learn to read Greek and Hebrew. Or not. Or not.
What chapters did you want us to read?
1 to 11.
Genesis 1 to 11.
1 to 11. It's always good to sit down and read a big chunk of the Bible, like read a gospel all through, or read a big chunk of the patriarchal and other narratives from go to woe. Because actually, when you read things through in a context, by the end of it, you may have a different point of view than if you're just dipping in and out of various verses and passages in it. And we don't read our Bibles enough. We just don't.